Hello, everyone, and welcome to a channel dedicated to narratives of the self like memoirs, autobiographies, diaries, correspondences. Today, we want to have a look at the wonderful journal by James Boswell, written between 1762 and 1763, and usually known under the name of the London Journals. Now, it might be the best journal that you'll ever read in your life. Even if you're not really interested in James Boswell himself, maybe you don't know him at all, and it really doesn't matter. This is an absolutely wonderful book. Now, why is it wonderful? Well, there's a few reasons, obviously, and I realize this is subjective to some extent, but hopefully there also are objective reasons for you to go and simply read this wonderful book. First of all, Boswell, even though he is still famous to this day, very well remembered to this day for his biography of Samuel Johnson. That's probably how people remember Boswell these days. In 1762, Boswell is about 18, 19, and is coming down from Scotland. And who is Boswell at the time? Well, he's the youth who dreams of the arts. He dreams of the literary scene. He reads a lot of books, he reads poetry, and he wants to, well, be a writer perhaps, but certainly has artistic aspirations. But he comes from Scotland, where his father is a judge, a very important man, and also a very, rigid, perhaps, man. And his father has very clear intentions for him. So he granted James, his son, about a year to go and see what it's like in London. After which, he's supposed to go back to Scotland and study to become a lawyer. So basically, the setup of these journals is very simple. It's a very young guy dreaming of the big city and its literary scene, finally getting to that city. And that in itself is incredible, of course, because we get a very young person encountering an incredibly frantic and also very well known world at the time. He's desperate to explore, he's desperate to see things, he's desperate to meet people. And at the same time, of course, he's very sort of immature, might be the word. Not quite immature, perhaps. He doesn't know so much about the world yet, perhaps. And so we get, if only that, a portrait of London in the 18th century, at a time, 1760s, where so many great figures, of course, roamed the streets of London, and we'll get back to some of them in a minute. His discovery of London is facilitated, of course, by a few contacts that he has. And very quickly, he will meet Samuel Johnson, not that quickly, but rather quickly, in fact. And so a good portion of the London journals revolved around his meetings and discussions with Johnson. And as usual, in his diaries, because Boswell will write many more diaries afterwards until his death, as usual, those diaries are a mixture of wide-eyed, juvenile admiration and surprise, and a soul that tries to grow. And so we always have those two poles in Boswell, really. That is the man of the world who wants to appear, who wants to be, who wants to attain something, and at the same time, the guy inside that persona who's desperately aware that he's not cutting it, that he's not at the level he wants to be at. He wants to believe he can be, he wants to believe he is, certainly later that will be the case, probably much more than in those journals. But here he's so young that basically he also understands that he has things to do in order to get better. Now, what does he mean by getting better, by improving? Well, first of all, a feature of those journals, as in others later, but certainly of this one, is the notes he writes to himself, reminders of what to do in order to become a better man, in order to improve. He writes those notes, for example, to himself at the end of a day when he writes, I don't know, in January, he writes, I did this, I did that. And at the end of the entry, he will say something like, remember not to drink too much, remember to hold to your opinions, but be open to, etc., etc. Little reminders like, I don't know, post-its you can put on the fridge to remind yourself, to buy coffee for tomorrow. Well, he's trying to remind himself to grow, to learn, to be more calm, to listen more, but at the same time to be confident in what he has to say, etc. And this wonderful sort of psychological growth, or not, is one of the delights of those journals. Now, obviously, another way to grow and to learn is to be with more learned people than he is. And because he will meet Samuel Johnson, who was one of the most, if not the most famous figure in London at the time, well, through him, he will meet, I mean, everybody. So, of course, Johnson's friends, Garrick, the great actor, the one who revolutionized acting in England in the 18th century. Joshua Reynolds, the painter, who was probably one of the most famous at the time as a portraitist. He was constantly busy. His biographer says that some days he was painting 3 or 4 portraits at the same time. David Hume, of course, the philosopher, who Boswell will get to know very well later on, and they will be close friends. Gibbon, of course, is there, the Roman Empire writer. Basically, everybody is there. And because Boswell is trying to become the equal of those men that he really looks up to and admire enormously, he's constantly trying to learn from them, sponge things of them, retain attitudes or words from those people so that he's inspired by those things. But at the same time, of course, he's desperately trying to be at their level. And so he participates, and he that's where his vanity at times, of course, show very clearly through when, he's delighted because, Johnson said, well said, Boswell, or, when somebody gives him a compliment, he's immediately over the moon. And he's not shy, perhaps because he's young, perhaps because that's his personality, but he's certainly not shy about saying that he is quite happy and that his vanity has been flattered and that perhaps it's a sign that he is becoming, that he is growing, etc. So the London scene in the 18th century, from scientists to philosophers to playwrights, they're all there. And he mixes with them, not in nice salons or anything, but much more often in cafes around London, in restaurants. And those portraits are simply, unique and uniquely wonderful. Now, of course, what runs throughout those journals is therefore this idea of growth, but it's also because Boswell is under pressure, as I said in the beginning, from his father. He's been given about a year, and in fact, he will get more time because later on, Boswell will go on a grand tour. The grand tour in the 18th century was what the well-born would do, and they would leave from anything from a year to 3 to explore. Typically, they would go through France, Italy, of course, perhaps Germany, coming back, and every time living, staying and living in any place for a month at a time, usually. But that was the thing that had to be done, the grand tour. So Boswell will do that later as well. During his grand tour, he will meet Voltaire, he will meet Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Paoli, the Corsican general. So his life will continue later on. But here, it's just a year in London, and he's under pressure from his father because he has to go back and study law, and he doesn't want to do that. He has very little interest in becoming a lawyer. Again, he aspires to art and creation and beauty, and that's what he wants. He doesn't want to go back to Scotland and bury himself in books simply to become a lawyer. In fact, he will become a lawyer. And to all account, he will have a very, very sort of middling, one might say mediocre career as a lawyer. And perhaps the seeds of that mediocrity as a lawyer, not as a man, as a lawyer, are to be found in this journal, where it is so clear what he wants and what he dreams of becoming, and he cannot be further from becoming a lawyer in Scotland, of course. Similarly, the journals are so. In the journals, you have some of his communication with his father, which is at times very difficult, but also communication with his friends. Temple, for example, William Temple will be friends with him throughout his life. Temple is in Scotland; is a very different type of person, and so he turns to Temple to sort of get advice, reassurance that he's on the right path. And it's also very interesting to see that psychological portrait, basically. Now, obviously, Boswell and his journals are remarkable also because Boswell was a tormented individual, perhaps. Peter Quennell wrote a very nice short essay on Boswell with a heavy sort of psychological bent, and also psychological studies have been dedicated to Boswell's life. So Boswell was tormented, and especially at that time, remember, it's 1920, so obviously there are things like women and sex very much on his mind. And remember, this is the 18th century, so yes, it is a licentious century by many in many ways, but of course, it is not the same thing as it is today. He is tormented by his literary career, by his dreams, by his need, to some extent, to respect and honor his father. Very strong, do what your father told you to do, but at the same time, the desire to be a new Johnson, the desire to be a new Hume, that's what he wants. And something that will be, let's say, routine in his life, unfortunately, is also drinking. Boswell drinks, likes to drink, or at least he drinks, and he's also quite often the worse for wear, it has to be said, and he's very conscious of that himself. Hence the little notes that he writes to himself from time to time. Remember, don't drink too much. And then, of course, the following entry will be just the following day. Yesterday I went out and I drank too much. So you have this constant promise to oneself, oh, I didn't follow my own ideas. Oh, I promised that I will do better. Oh, I realized I didn't, etc., etc. I read somewhere, and I think it's in Quennell, but I'm not quite sure, that Boswell may have had up to 14 times gonorrhea. Endemic problem, of course, at that time, where protection existed, of course, but protection was not obviously developed the way it is now. So gonorrhea, unfortunately, was very common, also because Boswell mostly goes to prostitutes. I mean, obviously, he's not going to have sex with well-born women left, right, and center. That's just not possible. Prostitutes it will be, like anybody else at that time, of course. But prostitutes, unfortunately, also very often bring gonorrhea. And so we have all this. That is, he is aware of all those things. He suffers from it. He knows that it is bad for him, not only from a hygienic or health point of view, but because this is not the type of man he wants to be. He wants to be a man in control of his emotions. He wants to be a rational man. Remember, 1760, 61, 62, 63. Those are years in England very influenced by Voltaire, the Enlightenment, the Century of Reason, Rousseau, of course. And Boswell knows all those things. And so this picture of a new rational man, as it were, in charge of himself, is sort of ideal picture he has in his mind of himself. But again and again, he fails to reach that height. And that is that torment in him that runs throughout the journals. And at times it's heartbreaking when we see that he promised himself to do better and still cannot do it. And yet, the honesty in all of this, the open heartedness about trying to improve, about who he wants to be and why, is, of course, the beauty in those journals. Now, that's the last, and perhaps it is the first, and probably it is the first, of course, quality of those journals. It is their openness. Now, you have all heard of Pepys' diaries, probably the most famous diaries in the English language, famous for their openness. And we'll probably come back to that at some stage, because Pepys, believing that nobody would ever be able to write what he wrote in code at the time, simply said it all. And for that, the Pepys diaries are a monument, of course. But the Boswell diaries, or the journal, are also a monument, because similarly, and Boswell at the time, Boswell didn't know about Pepys, and Pepys hadn't been rediscovered yet. Boswell opens his heart, and he says what he does, and he tells us what he does. And remember, he does a lot of drinking, he does a lot of pining for women, he does a lot of thinking about himself, he does a lot of describing of others, he does a lot of writing down the bon mots and the quips and the funny lines of Johnson and the others. And he's trying to mend his ways. And in order to mend his ways, he makes those ways clear to us. So his failings, all the things he's not good at, all the things that he consistently fails to do or attain, all those human foibles that he's guilty of, he puts it on the page because he wants to see them so that he stops being like that. He won't. That's the thing that we know later on, not in those journals, but when we know more about Boswell afterwards, he will never really change. And when Boswell goes on a grand tour, goes to Holland, he will be more or less the same man. And that is also the reputation he will acquire in this set of people at the time, of course, of a well-meaning, boisterous, a bit drunk, rather vain, immensely likable, perhaps, man. And all those things are already there in the London journals. So in conclusion, what can we say? Boswell, while he is most famous for his Life of Johnson, a wonderful book, by the way, but still, in fact deserves to be famous for the London journals. An absolutely wonderful text, not very long text, easy to read. Don't be afraid, it's not 18th century English, like incomprehensible English. It's very easy to read, it reads very fluently. There's absolutely no problem of comprehension. This is very clear English. And at the same time, this openness, this clarity about himself, and lack of clarity at the same time, because of course he has demons, but he doesn't recognize them all, is a wonderful, wonderful portrait of somebody trying to improve himself and grow as it happens. All this within an incredible context, historical context, cultural, political context. All this makes those journals, the London journals by James Boswell, a monument, and I can only encourage you to go and grab them and start reading them. You won't regret it. Thank you.